Well, welcome to the first Sunday in Advent. Here we are getting ready for the Christmas season already. Going to be a very strange one. Well, because it's the first Sunday in Advent, guess what the theme is today? Yes, you're right, it's Easter. Well, Baptists were never particularly good at the liturgical year or working out what to do on what particular Sunday. And so I just have been feeling we're in need of a dose of resurrection power and the truth of the fact that Jesus is alive in a world where everything seems closed down and confusing. And on the one hand, hope seems imminent with the possible presence of a number of vaccines. On the other hand, it seems like we're very closed down in many countries around the world. Most of you, wherever you're watching this in the world, you're probably in a situation where there are growing numbers, or at least the apparent picture of growing numbers in your state or country, wherever you are. Here in the UK, we're seeing hospitalisations fall and the death rate fall and numbers fall at the end of November, and still going into a kind of third lockdown, which is being disguised as a number of tiers, but basically amounts to the same thing. So here we are trying to work out what really matters, and we're going to celebrate today the fact that Jesus is alive and reflect on passage in 1 Corinthians 15 about the fact that Jesus is risen from the dead, and that changes everything, gives everything in life a very different perspective. So this is what you'd be singing if you were on an Easter Sunday. Lo, Jesus meets us, risen from the tomb. Lovingly he greets us, scatters fear and gloom. That's what we need today for sure, the scattering of gloom from so much national, international, and of course our personal lives. Let the church with gladness hymns of triumph sing. That's what the church is supposed to be doing, not cowering away in a corner somewhere, but singing songs and hymns of triumph based on the resurrection of Jesus. For her Lord now liveth, death has lost its sting. And of course those words are taken from the end of 1 Corinthians chapter 15. In verse 54, Paul writes this: when the perishable has been clothed with the imperishable, and the mortal with immortality. Notice he contrasts that which is not going to last with that which is going to last forever. The very human part of us and the glorious divine which Jesus brings. He says, death has been swallowed up in victory. Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? Imagining the bite or the sting of a Middle Eastern scorpion, or in our case more like a wasp or a bee or something, a sting which brings pain, and of course the sting of some Middle Eastern snakes and scorpions brought death itself to the person who was unfortunate enough to put their hand down in an inappropriate place or walk where they shouldn't have walked, and so be bitten or stung. So Paul's pretty clear that the enemy of death has been defeated. Many psychologists reckon that all fears are ultimately grounded in a fear of death, a fear of our own mortality, a fear of what lies beyond the grave. And so philosophers, theologians, poets, authors have all speculated on this other world, what's to come. And of course, in the first century, when Paul was writing, death was a terrible, horrible thing hovering over everything. It was a frightening end. People would do anything to avoid its arrival. And of course, many people died fairly young. And so death was this sort of ultimate energy, ultimate enemy that was obviously a really significant thing in the first century. Shakespeare wrote quite a lot about it in that poetic form in which he had. There's a traveller to a land from whom no one's returned. Actually, we want to tell Shakespeare that Jesus has actually returned from that land beyond the grave. But he has his heroes soliloquizing, saying, well, yes, death may come, but in that sleep of death, what dreams may come? What's it going to be like? Am I going to be dreaming, conscious, awake? Lots of reflection. So here's Paul telling us that in the face of a pandemic, or in the first century, warfare, pain, famine, problems of a variety of kinds that could bring an early death, Jesus is the great conqueror of death. And so that's what we need today, to be reminded that Jesus is alive and that his victory over death is complete. So for Christians, though the spectre of death stalks the land, and though we're forever being terrified by the media about the fact that this horrible disease, COVID-19, kills people, and so we're terrified to be associated with it, or some of us are even frightened to go outside, death itself has been defeated. And we sing, of course, at Easter time, songs that remind us about this victory, and we're coming from a place of sadness and pain and difficulty, and we need to see that defeat. Here are some words that Townsend and Getty have made famous, which many of us have sung in recent Easter years. See Mary weeping, where is he laid? As in sorrow she turns from the empty tomb. She's filled with brokenness on that first Easter Sunday morning, weeping. Many of us feel that same brokenness. Where's all this going? Where's it going to end? And yet she hears a voice speaking, calling her name. It's the Master, the Lord raised to life again. And if there's anything we need to hear in this COVID time, it's the voice of the Master. It's the fact that Jesus speaks to us from beyond the grave and tells us how loved we are and how victorious we are in him over this ultimate enemy of death. And it's interesting that Paul doesn't shy away from a difficult question. For Paul, the resurrection is not some sort of fantasy land, not some imagined thing you hope and hang on to for a kind of certainty that it's not particularly real, but if you believe it hard enough, it'll probably be okay. No, for Paul, truth and fact matters. In fact, he raises this earlier in 1 Corinthians 15. You might want to see it. But if it's preached that Christ has been raised from the dead, how can some of you say there isn't a resurrection? Even the first century, there's nothing beyond the grave. If there is no resurrection of the dead, this is 1 Corinthians 15:13, then not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. So here's Paul facing head on the question of truth. If I'm making all this up, says Paul, if Jesus hasn't really been raised from the dead, then it's completely, it's futile. Our preaching is a waste of time, and the faith, the common faith we say we believe, is nonsense. No point believing it, simply not true. So just some sort of fantasy belief in the afterlife, which we cling on to in the vague hope it'll all be all right, that's not going to see us through. So the question of truth really matters. And so the Bible is at pains in the Gospels and in the letters to lay out all sorts of evidences for the resurrection of Jesus. We, of course, take it by faith, but not only by faith, by some eyewitness accounts. Mary, who sees him, the disciples who see him, 500 at one time who see him, doubting Thomas with all his cynicism about the resurrection, sees Jesus alive. And so the Bible records those eyewitness accounts for us, in a sense, to bolster what we know by faith, that Jesus, born at Christmas time, yes, celebrated at this Advent season, died on the cross and rose from the dead and is alive, not just alive in the first century on the first Easter Sunday, but alive today, living in our world, living in the lives of those who know and love Jesus and who want to serve him and follow him. So this reality, the resurrection of Jesus, is to encourage us on this week in which, in the UK at least, we're being transferred from lockdown later this week to a tier system that feels very, very like lockdown. The question of truth, is Jesus really alive, grappling with that fact, matters to Paul, because truth matters generally. Our faith is a historic faith. It's based in some facts, not in how we feel, but in some real historical reality. And one of the questions that many of us have been having over these last months is the fact that there seems an absence of reality and truth in about what we're hearing. For example, the way COVID deaths are reported. People are said to have died within 28 days of a positive test. But that means if you're out walking and you've had a test and test positive and you're hit by a train and die, it's recorded as a COVID death. How irresponsible is that? It's simply not the truth about the effect of this virus. We need much more to be treated like grown-ups in all of this, because the truth is not just simply recording a number, but having the number explain. What does it actually mean? And that's why even those scenarios about 50,000 deaths by October the 13th, which of course never happened, 50,000 cases, and 4,000 deaths by November, which of course didn't happen either. Those scenarios, wild, crazy and irresponsible though they are statistically, would be better understood, presented with some alternative graphs, if we're to know the truth about what's really happening. Because, yes, the virus is active and, tragically, it kills people, particularly the elderly and the vulnerable. But what about another set of graphs which would help present the truth, that is the total picture? Why can't we have a graph about the number of extra people who've taken their own lives because of lockdown? Or the guesstimate, which is what many of the models are about coronavirus, the guesstimate about how many people are going to die because of undiagnosed cancers or an undiagnosed heart condition. Wouldn't it be more truthful to give us the effects of lockdown? After all, we'll keep being told that's the cure. That would be a much more truthful way of presenting things. And we need to be treated like adults. Christians believe in a resurrection, not because they have got a childish, innocent faith. Their faith has been tested. Many of you watching this will have had many trials and difficulties in your life, grappling with personal circumstances, a fractured relationship, unemployment, a diagnosis which may be terminal, a tragedy has struck. We Christians are not fools. We want to examine the evidence of our faith. It's full of faith, yes, but based on facts. And so we want to be treated like adults in this whole corona thing. The whole business about Christmas here in the UK has just driven me completely mad, being spoken to by the government like we're children. Now, boys and girls, you're going to get a few days around Christmas Day in which you can meet with members of your family. Aren't you lucky to be treated in this way? But by the way, don't take advantage of that, you naughty children, because if you do, Granny will die and you'll be burying her in January. So we're telling you, don't be naughty during this period. I mean, it feels utterly patronising, the way this thing is being sold to us here in the UK. Oh, and by the way, lockdown's definitely ending on December the 2nd. Oh, wait. The tier that everybody in the country, almost everybody is in, feels very, very like lockdown. Anyway, it just feels utterly mind-blowingly irresponsible not to simply spell out in much more adult details the wider implications of what is actually going on. What are the true costs of lockdown? In health terms, in mental health terms, in life chances for our young people, for our children. What's the real cost? We're grown-ups. We ought to be faced with the reality of that. When you become a Christian, you don't have to throw your brains away. Your brain should be actively engaged in your faith. Actively engaged. That's why Paul asked this question. Listen, if Jesus isn't really raised from the dead, it's all a waste of time. But he is. He was seen. And we Christians should be rigorously arguing for truth. What's actually going on here? And what are the consequences of what's happening? Because we're going to find ourselves, if we're not careful, in a world in which we've irreparably damaged the future of our babies and children and young people. And that would be a tragedy that made COVID-19 seem nothing, believe me, in comparison. So we better get real about what's happening, just as Paul encourages the Corinthians to be certain about what their faith is. And one of the sadnesses for me about this whole thing has not just been the dishonesty of various government pronouncements and the manipulation of statistics to meet a particular end. That's sad, but in a sense predictable. What's been really sad is the lack of passion and faith and victory seen in the Church of Jesus corporately and some individual Christians. Now, some Christians have managed to hang on to their faith and not just hang on to it, but celebrate it with joy. And I hope that you'll be in that group today, so that you'll be able to sing with resonance the Easter songs, even though it's the wrong time of year. One of the amusing things I remember when I was pastoring in a church one summer is us preaching on the second birth, being born again, and I chose the hymn "Hark the Herald Angels Sing" with its final line about born to give them second birth. I just loved looking out on the congregation, watching them sing a carol in June. It was great, and actually the carol had far more power than singing it for the 25th time during December. So here we are, Easter in Advent, the resurrection story which is really true. True, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And so we can sing, "No more we doubt thee, glorious Prince of Life. Life is naught without thee. Aid us in our strife." Many of us feel in a time of strife. "Make us more than conquerors through thy deathless love, and bring us safe through Jordan to thy home above." That confidence in the resurrection. Or here's Stuart Townend again. "And we are raised with him. Death is dead. Love has won. Christ has conquered. And we shall reign with him, for he lives. Christ is risen from the dead." So this Advent season, I'd like to wish you all a really happy Easter and pray that God will fill you today with the hope of the resurrection, knowing that it's not just faith which drives you to a risen Lord, but the facts of history which point to him, dead on a cross for our sins, and now alive in us and risen from the dead, reigning and ruling forever and ever. And we have our security in him, this risen